So hello, I'm Neil. I'm Neil Perkin. I'm the author of Building the Agile Business. So I've been writing, speaking, and consulting around digital transformation now for about 10 years across many different sectors, lots of different types of organizations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about digital transformation to begin with and then take that into HR practice. I did a fascinating piece of research on behalf of e-consultancy on changing HR practice in the digital world. I interviewed a lot of senior people in a broad range of organizations and there was some fantastic feedback around how HR itself is going on this digital transformation journey. So I'm going to start here, which is there, yes. So I saw this shared on Twitter about 2 weeks ago. So bless you, Flynn, but this is not what digital transformation is all about. In fact, I think it's the polar opposite, arguably, of what digital transformation is. And I think it's a common mistake that many organizations make, which is to chase shiny technology and not do the people side of transformation. If you do chase shiny technology, I think this is where you end up. So this is Fox News doing their digital transformation, well trumpeted. They spent millions of dollars. They brought in these big area touchscreens, as they're called. Though behind the orange newsreader there, had journalists sat behind sweeping away like this on these big screens. Ridiculous. That is not what digital transformation is. That is potentially damaging, I think, to a business when we have that much focus on technology without the commensurate focus on our people. So in the book that was released about April this year, I talk about three key contexts. I'm a fan of alliteration. So 3 C's of context. The first one being changing competitive contexts, changing consumer contexts, and then our response to that, of course, is changing company contexts. So 3 contexts, I think, that are changing more rapidly than ever before. Competitive context, for example, there's a famous piece of research that's done by Professor Richard Foster at Yale University, and he looked at the S&P 500 and the average lifespan of those organizations dating back decades. Back in 1958, it was 61 years. Today, it's about 18 years. In fact, his prediction was that by the year 2027, 3/4 of the companies in the S&P 500 would be companies that we haven't heard of today. Rapidly changing consumer contexts. I saw an interesting stat actually just last week, on Singles Day in China. So Alibaba, one of the most successful digital retailers in the world, run a thing called Singles Day. It's a bit like Black Friday. But they did $25 billion in sales on one day. Just that one day. And put that into context, Black Friday plus Cyber Monday in the US market is about $6.8 billion. But the interesting thing about that was that 90% of those sales were on mobile. We've transitioned a huge amount in a short space of time. So the challenge really then is company context. This is the challenge that I see a lot within organizations. Technological change, changing exponentially. Consumer context, competitive context changing exponentially, but most organizations, of course, change logarithmically. Change is hard, because it's people, of course. How do we close that gap? I think that's all about the choices that we make. It's about strategies. It's about how we work with our people in order to bring them on the journey with us. So that's what I'm going to talk a bit about. So let's have an example first of what I think we shouldn't be doing. So Kodak, of course, is the poster child of disruption. Went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy some years ago. But famously, Kodak actually invented digital imaging. Many people think that it was actually, they missed digital imaging. They came up with the digital camera. The guy that invented digital camera worked for Kodak. But the problem that Kodak has was very much a people challenge. It was the transition from one way of working, an entrenched business model, certain processes and practices, and understanding the value creation with another business model. That's the challenge I see in many organizations, is that transition, bringing the people on the journey with you. So this, of course, is Thomas Edison. So he invented many great things, but he also built the first power station in Manhattan, in New York, back in the 1880s. And the interesting thing about that was that he was able to deliver power locally to not just homes, but also to factories. And there's a good story about the electrification of manufacturing in America, because it took about 30 years before any real productivity benefits came from the electrification of factories. So prior to electricity, of course, factories were powered by steam. You had this massive steam engine sat at the center of the factory, and these shafts that ran off it, the power source, and then these belts that ran off the shafts like that to individual workstations. I mean, it must have been quite a thing with all the noise and the steam and so on, but the whole factory was orientated around this central power source. Then when electricity came along, of course, the first thing that the factory owners did was to replace the big steam engine with a big electric motor. So nothing really changed. There was no productivity benefits at all. But of course, what they were missing is that what you could really do with electricity is you could have a distributed source of power. You could take it to individual workstations and actually realign manufacturing itself, the manufacturing process, and do things like the production line, the mass production line, of course, famous from Henry Ford. But the point is that unless you really change the fabric of how you operate as a business, you cannot benefit from the real potential of new technologies. What was true of electricity, I think, is true of digital technologies today. So there's a great piece of research to support this combination of people and technology. It comes from MIT and Capgemini. So they did a study of about 400 companies over a number of years, and they were mapping them on two axes here. So one was digital intensity. That's the propensity of those organizations to invest in shiny technology. The bottom one is transformation management intensity. That's all the people stuff. So we're talking here about behaviors and skills and cultures, investment in the people side of change. So two interesting quadrants, I think, here. One is the top right, so the digerati. Those companies that invested in both technology and people were 26% more profitable than the average performance across those 400 companies. But the other interesting one, I think, is fashionistas, that top left one. Invest in shiny technology, don't do the people stuff, you actually damage your business. So I think the challenge with this is that when I walk into organizations and there's this idea of a burning platform and a CEO's done a presentation about how we need to digitally transform, what often then happens looks a bit like this.
Welcome to Munich for the 27th City Olympiad, an event held traditionally every 3.7 years, which this year has brought together competitors from over 4 million different countries. And here we are at the start of the first event of the afternoon, the second semi-final of the 100 yards for people with no sense of direction. I'll just give you the competitors. Lane 1, Skolomoski of Poland. Lane 2, Zatapatik of France. Lane 3, Grobovich of the United States. Next to him, Drabble of Trinidad. Next to him, Fernandez of Spain. And in the outside lane, Orman of Brazil. Well, that was fun, wasn't it?
Surprisingly common. You get lots of people running off in lots of different directions, trying to do something and trying to make a change and a difference. And of course, alignment and direction is really central to that. The vision that the company needs to achieve and how you bring your people towards that vision. So I'd like to talk about the combination of two things here. Customer experience is a huge driver for change within many organizations, as I'm sure you recognize. A big area of focus. And of course, the challenge with customer experience is it goes horizontally across organizations. It doesn't really respect organizational functions and silos. If you're a customer of the organization, you don't really care if it's customer service or marketing or what channel it is that you're communicating through that company, to the company with. It's just the brand. It's just the company. So customer experience is a great area of prioritization for digital transformation, but it's nothing if we don't combine that with employee experience and bring those people on the journey with us. So the crossover here is customer experience plus employee experience. CX plus EX equals digital transformation. So I don't know whether many of you have read Laszlo Bock's book here. It's a fantastic book if you haven't. So he is was the head of people operations at Google. Fascinating book at how they revolutionized really the way in which they did HR at Google, or they called it people operations. So of course, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot today about data, analytics, MI, and so on. There was some interesting feedback on the Slido poll just there about where you're at in that journey. But I think the interesting thing here is that when Laszlo Bock managed and ran that team, they deliberately recruited from 3 different areas. So traditional HR formed about a third of the team. The next third was formed from consultants, so often from management consultancy backgrounds. And the third one was data analysts, people who did not have an HR background at all, but they were there to drive the data and analytical capability of the team. So I think the thing to think about here is how you can combine a single customer view, as you would call it, or a single employee view, and map employee journeys, but also combine that with pattern recognition. It's a very common approach that you often see extracting value from data through that idea of a profile and a single customer view combined with pattern recognition across data from the crowd. This Gartner model here on the right-hand side, when I did that piece of research about HR in the digital age, a lot of people were pretty, maybe in the first two areas of this, but recognized the potential, I think, of actually going up this value chain here towards more predictive and ultimately prescriptive forms of analytics. So I think in the context of all of these rapidly changing contexts, the other big piece of feedback that was prevalent in the piece of research that I did and the companies that I talked to is about how many of our traditional practices actually really need to be ripped up and started again. So, for example, performance review and management. The idea of doing an annual performance review when things are changing so quickly, talking about your performance a year ago makes no sense. So a far more agile and adaptive approach to performance management. There's a series of organizations, of course, including Accenture and Adobe and Microsoft, who've moved away from annual performance review processes towards more iterative and flexible and often informal, forward-looking, informal performance review. So OKRs is something which I wrote about in the book, comes from Intel in the 70s, adopted by a large number of different organizations now, including Google, of course. But OKRs is objectives and key results. And objectives, key results is you have 3 objectives every quarter, 3 key results that map to those objectives, but it enables you to be far more iterative and flexible and responsive in the way in which you are managing your people, and therefore giving feedback more regularly, course correcting more regularly, and so on. But it also helps with alignment through the organization. So the reason why I think things like that are so important is because of this. You know, my favorite business quote doesn't actually come from a businessman, it comes from Mike Tyson. I think businesses are getting punched in the face more often than ever before. So the only response to that is we need to be emergent and more adaptive, because there's 3 types of problem in the world: simple, complicated, and complex. Simple is the domain of best practice. It's a bit like following a recipe. If we follow the same steps every single time, we get the same answer or the same result. But sending a rocket to the moon is, of course, more complicated because there's more variables involved. But once you've done it once, you stand a better chance of doing it again. So that's the domain of expertise. But raising a child is a complex problem. Just because you've raised one successfully doesn't mean to say that you can do the same again with a second child. So, yeah, different person, changing context every single day. So that's a complex adaptive problem. So the only way through that is to experiment, test and learn, be far more adaptive and responsive in how you're doing that. That, I think, is the business environment in which we're in now, complex and adaptive. So therefore, we need to do far more experimentation and test and learn in order to find our way through it. So it's no coincidence, therefore, that processes like Agile and Lean and design thinking, all of these digital native processes that have grown up with digital are now far more prevalent within organizations. So I first started writing about Agile about 10 years ago. Now the context of Agile has gone way beyond technology teams, much broader across organizations, and it's the difference really, I guess, between just doing Agile and being Agile, because we need both of those things. Yeah? So Agile, of course, you have your core direction, you know exactly where you're going, you know your vision, good sense of direction, but you iterate in order to get there. So the first thing that you do in the first work sprint is that you focus on the 20% of the thing that's going to deliver 80% of the value. And you design it, you build it, you ship it, you put it live. You get feedback earlier in the process from your customers, real customers wherever possible, and then you use that in order to iterate and learn as you go. So you design, build, chip, test, learn, test, learn, test, learn. You stay far closer to customer need all the way through the process. I think these kinds of iterative ways of working have far broader application than just software development. I see these kinds of principles, practices, working, ways of thinking, expanding across many different functions in the organization. And I think it helps in terms of vision, alignment, but also adaptiveness. Because a great quote from Jeff Bezos, of course, here, so this is the founder of Amazon, stubborn on vision, flexible on details. That, to me, is a really good way of understanding how you can apply more adaptive, iterative working to all kinds of situations and problems within your organization. So the thing about Agile, of course, is that it's not just a process. It's a culture, and there is lots of different assets that sit around it, one of which is small multidisciplinary teams. So the point I would make here is that small teams can now drive big change in an organization, empowered by digital technologies. Amazon have a thing, they call it the two-pizza team. No team in that business gets bigger than the number of people it takes to feed with 2 large pizzas, which, depending on how hungry you are, I guess is about sort of 6 to 8 people. Why? Because, of course, what happens if you get beyond that number is communication increases exponentially, and so everything starts to slow down. And Jeff Bezos is pathological about retaining agility within that business. And so small teams equal quick, fast, maneuverable, responsive results. But also there's, I think, something here about the culture and the way in which we actually operate here, not just about how we put people together, but also the types of decision-making that we have within organizations. This is also taken from Jeff Bezos. His last shareholders letter came out 2 months ago. It's a really interesting document. He talks there about 4 key things that he thinks are really important in retaining agility as Amazon scales. One of them was high-velocity decision-making. He talks about how most companies often use one-size-fits-all decision-making, and actually, there are many different types of decisions. So for lots of situations, instead of waiting until you have 90% of the information that you need in order to make that decision, you just wait until you've got 70%, and it's better to make that decision and then course correct than it is to hang around and wait until you've got 90%. The other interesting thing about this, I think, is disagree and commit, which is a phrase that Amazon use in order to avoid consensual decision-making, slowing things down. I see this a lot with larger companies that I work with, how consensus or the need to get everybody, every single person in the room aligned around the thing that you're going to do, how that can really slow things down. So using a simple phrase like disagree and commit, I disagree with that thing, but I'm going to commit to make it happen because everybody else thinks it's a good idea, is a way of getting past that in order to actually be more adaptive and responsive, of course, and to move faster. So sprint working. Sprint working is, of course, the bedrock of agile, lean, design thinking, all of these iterative processes. But I think the interesting thing about sprint working is that look at what you're actually doing here. If you're compartmentalizing work into sprints, like 4-week sprints, each sprint process has a similar kind of process. At the beginning, what you're doing is you're reprioritizing. You're updating the backlog, as it calls, the list of things that you need to do. Then you plan what you're going to do. You're setting your goals for the next 4 weeks. You go into the work. You do daily stand-ups to help you stay agile and to remove blockers and barriers to moving fast. And then at the end of the sprint, you do the what and the how. What have we achieved, but also how did we work together, the retrospective. So I think the valuable thing that I see when sprint working is introduced into organizations is that you start to embed adaptive strategy into the fabric of the way in which you're working, because every 4 weeks you're reprioritizing what you do. Then at the end of the sprint, you're also embedding learning into the organization. You're developing a learning culture because you're talking about not just what you achieved, but how you work together as a team and how you could do better next time. So I think this is a very motivating way of working. So I want to just finish off really just thinking a bit about the cultural attributes of HR and how HR is changing and the role that I see that HR can play in being such a critical part of driving this change. So when agile working is introduced into organizations, it's often a very energizing way of working, very energizing. And for a simple reason, I think. This book here, The Progress Principle by Teresa Amabile, she's the head of research at Harvard. So she writes in this book about she did a big study, actually, a big work diary study. Thousands of people filling in work diaries every single day, saying what was a good day, what was a bad day. And she came up with this idea of the positive inner work life. And this was the idea that how you felt about your work environment, what it felt like to come into the office in the morning, how you perceive your office environment. And the one thing that contributed towards the positive inner work life more than anything else was the idea of progress. Progress. Really simple but powerful idea. Put simply, you spend your day in meetings, emails, firefighting, it's a bad day. But if you make progress towards a goal, an objective, something that you really want to make happen, that's a good day. So part of the reason why I think sprint working and agile and lean processes like that can be very motivating is because you can visibly see the value that you're delivering on a regular basis. A lot of the assets that sit around agile working are all about transparency, being able to see the value that you're creating and moving forwards quickly. So one of my favorite non-fiction books, Dan Pink, Drive, he's a lawyer turned psychologist, fascinating book on the truth about what really motivates people in the workplace. He talks in this book about the limitation of money. It's one of the most well-researched books I think I've ever read, but it's not dry at all. It's really, really interesting. Supported by lots of academic research, he names three things, three intrinsic motivators, which are key to really motivating people in the workplace: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is the ability to make a difference in the area that you're responsible for. Mastery is the ability to learn and to improve and to get better over time. Purpose is the feeling that you're working for something important and you have a sense of direction about what you're doing. Intuitively, that just kind of feels right, doesn't it? But the interesting thing about this is when I was reading this book, the companies that I think are making a big success out of digital transformation and have that kind of digital native culture, the correlation between the kind of things that he was talking about and the cultural attributes of those organizations was really stark. They are all characterized by high levels of autonomy, good levels of mastery and learning, and they have a clear mission, vision, and purpose about what they're doing. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of here when we're talking about learning and learning cultures. One of them is biases. So an interesting story here, there's a guy called Abraham Wald, who was a famous mathematician. He fled the Nazis at the end of the 30s and went to work with the US Air Force in America at MIT. And they had a project at the time which was all about stopping them losing so many bomber planes over Germany, because the US Air Force were doing the daytime bombing, of course, over Germany. And so they were proposing to armor plate the planes. But the problem was they couldn't armor plate the whole plane, otherwise it would be too heavy to fly. So they looked at where the bullet holes were on the planes. And they noticed that the clusters of bullet holes were around the wings, the center of the fuselage, and around the tail gunner. And so they said to Abraham Wald, that's where we're going to put our armor plating. And he said, you know what, you should do completely the opposite, because those are the planes that are making it back. Think about that. Yeah, confirmation bias. Yeah, we actively seek out things to confirm our existing worldview. Success bias. We're very good at learning from successes, much far less good at learning from failures. These kinds of biases, I think, are very powerful within businesses. We need to challenge those kinds of biases and learn from wherever we can, successes and failures. So Google, interestingly, did a fascinating study, Laszlo Bock talks about it in his book, on high-performing teams. What's the difference between high-performing, low-performing teams? 100 teams in a 2-year study. All the things that you would think would make a difference, like team composition and education made, actually very little difference indeed. The thing that really made a difference to performance was what they called psychological safety. And that's the ability to bring yourself into the office environment, to say what you really mean and think. This is the best definition that I've seen of psychological safety, combining comfort with dissent, plus mutual trust and respect. How can you encourage those kinds of cultures and behaviors within your organization? Because that's a culture for moving fast and a culture for real collaboration. But, of course, we need to combine that with learning. Amy Edison, another Harvard professor, has written a brilliant book about team culture and team learning called Teaming. And she talked a lot about how you combine psychological safety with accountability. You had lots of psychological safety. It's a very comfortable place to work, but you're not actually achieving a lot. But lots of accountability, no psychological safety, anxiety. You need both of those things to encourage a culture of learning. So interestingly, this is supported by a rolling study, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Gallup do some very interesting work in employee engagement. This rolling study that they've got, thousands of people in this study, analyzing the difference between high performance, low performance in the context of employee engagement. The 12 factors that they have isolated over the years, the 12 questions as they call them, the 12 elements of great managing, really, really useful. But the thing about that is that they're all the things that I've already talked about in terms of what Dan Pink talks about as well. The correlation here between employee engagement and employee experience and delivering against digital transformation and customer experience goals. We need to take account of our people, bringing our people on the journey with us. That, to me, is a key role in which HR can play within digital transformation. So I'm just going to finish with a final point here, which is just about aligning people to what they're really good at. And over time, I think we see many different models for change, but pioneers, settlers, and town planners is a really good one, because if you think about when we need to innovate, we need to ideate first, we come up with the ideas, but then we need to commercialize the ideas, and then we need to scale the ideas. But in my experience, I think people are good at different things. Some are great at ideation, some are great at commercialization, some really like institutionalizing, operationalizing. So align those people to what they're really good at. Don't expect people to be good at all three of those things. It's a really effective model that I've seen for actually how you can align how people are, their skills and culturally across the organization. And my last thought comes from Eric Ries, who wrote The Lean Startup, of course. It's still the best book about lean and lean methodologies in large organizations. But it's a very useful way for thinking about change in HR, change in digital transformation, change in organizations. Think big, start small, scale fast. Think big, we need a vision, direction for change. Start small. Find the routine, find the way, find your own way into agile, lean, sprint working, but scale fast. As soon as you find stuff that works, you scale it, and you scale fast. So, thank you.